So let's go ahead and get started. Well, first of all, thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you to the Arise team for generously offering to do this free webinar. For those who don't know me, my name is Asia Yule. I'm also a licensed therapist and founder of Therapist to Therapist. And so I just, slowly start to learn about CMI, and I'm also just very intrigued, and I'm like, we have to bring this to the community. So I'm so grateful that you all have joined us to just let us know about what CMI is, how it was developed, and all the many things. So I'm going to take some time to turn it over to the Rise team. I'll allow them to introduce themselves, and we would love to just even start with, what is CMI?
Awesome. I'll let Dr. Brian introduce himself.
Absolutely. Yeah. My name is Dr. Brian Lipsey. I'm a clinical psychologist. I work part of the time with the Cheyenne VA, where I spend a lot of time working with student veterans. That's part of my job at the VA. And a lot of my time in the VA is included working with, as you know, trauma, PTSD, and the whole nine. So a lot of background that is similar to what folks are putting in chat. So I like seeing that. I think we're, all in the same, heading the same direction, same mission. It's gonna be really cool to share what we're doing with CMI and my counterpart, Steph.
Yeah, I'm Stefana Johnson, and I actually live in Arizona, but I was raised in New Mexico, so I saw a fellow New Mexican on here, which is awesome. I specialize in PTSD as well, or trauma, worked with at-risk youth for many years, and we all have our own history. So I think oftentimes that's what brings us to this field. So I'm really excited to share this with you guys, and hopefully it's something that kind of resonates with you. So start with that first question. What is CMI? And it is an approach or a psychotherapy that is both experiential and humanistic, meaning, we try to bring in the experience that is the kind of like the core of it, and it's centered around the individual. And this is very important to us because, as you know, just because we are, from the same places or part of the same culture doesn't mean that our experiences are alike. Like, we are very different individuals. In CMI, we really truly train clinicians to serve as a guide, not as the informant, not the one that does the deciphering or the identifying the needs, rather guiding the individual to connect to that information from within. And we teach individuals to attune to signals. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we break it down. But really, everything that comes up, rather than focusing on symptoms, we see it all as like a signal. This is telling you something about what is necessary, what you need, or maybe what isn't aligned with who you are. And we use something called sensory motion expansion. So while often a lot of approaches are attempting to desensitize and decrease the distress, we essentially teach how to put some parameters around it so that you can go through it instead of trying to tune it out. And that actually serves as what guides us through with the signals. So we'll go into that as well. And then the goal is to integrate experiences. When we have, specific like experiences, especially those related to trauma, oftentimes it's very common for people to want to forget or shove them down and not think about it. But even if we shove them in the back of the closet, they still impact how we interact, how we view the world, how we view ourselves, and can cause a lot of limitations. And integration is like pulling those pieces out, seeing the whole puzzle, and recognizing maybe what we might be, where we could get stuck, or what are some things that we have learned over the years to survive that are no longer serving us. And so it's very empowering, and it allows you to see yourself from a different light. And then the outcome and really the goal is for the individual to feel different, bigger, stronger, wiser because of their experiences. And that increases the capacities they have to deal with life in the future. So, sometimes with trauma, we're wanting to heal. That doesn't mean that we're not going to face more adversity in the future. So we really are wanting to help individuals grow and increase their capacities to deal with life and all the challenges that come with it. So what is a critical memory? What are we referring to? When we think of memory, think of it as data, right? You have different types of memory. We know there's like implicit and explicit. So explicit is something that you can recall, like, your birthday or anniversary or things like that. And implicit is the things that are still driving you or informing you, but you cannot bring to your conscious awareness. This includes things like knowing how to do things, right? You might not remember learning how to walk, but you know how to walk. So you have the memory of how to walk, but you don't have the memory of learning how to walk. That's an example of like explicit and implicit. So there's many different ways of our system, our body, our mind storing information. But the memory that is critical is those ones that are experiences that really define us. It defines how we develop, the skills that we develop, our attachment strategies, how we view the world, what we do to survive, how we work through adversity or get stuck in adversity, right? And really how we form and how we maintain relationships, how we relate to others in the world, including the relationship with ourselves. So critical memories, often they're different in the sense that it evoke a strong belief, right? So you could call it an intuition, emotion, or reaction with very little input from the conscious mind. So if you have ever worked with individuals who, like, let's say they tried a cognitive approach to treat trauma and they know all the answers, they can tell you all the answers, but when that situation pops off, they just, boom, they go right back to what they did in the past, right? Because this is being driven, but from somewhere deeper inside. And then we go like, if you know better, you should do better. It doesn't always work that way because it's what your body knows, what your body stores that is driving your behavior. And so understanding this is really vital in terms of being effective, especially when working with complex trauma. So what do we mean by integrating experience? So let's say hypothetically, you were raised in a very safe household with your parents, and you have the white picket fence family. I've never met a person that has that history. But let's say, for example, you have everything that you need as a child to develop, to get to know yourself, to value yourself. And like you're worthy, you're lovable, you're unique, you bring certain skills. You might not be so good at others, and that's okay because we're all different. So with that mentality, that mindset, and those beliefs, what things you can do, what, that align with you, your responses are aligned. So, I'm a caring, compassionate person. So if I come across someone challenging me, I'm going to be caring and compassionate in my response. Now, I don't know if you know any people that are always congruent because we're humans and we have human experiences, but essentially this is our ability to stay present and stay aligned with our true self. We have a good sense of who we are, right, beneath all of the experience. So if I am a kind, compassionate person, I can approach situations where maybe somebody else isn't, but I don't lose sight of myself. I don't get influenced by external, circumstances as easily because I have a strong sense of self. That means our capacities have to be high. Our capacity to tolerate discomfort, our capacity for insight, for self-reflection, for awareness, our capacity to go through difficulty so that we can grow, to feel and experience emotions without getting derailed by them. All of those things, the higher the capacities are, the more resilient we are, the more we can think flexibly, the more we can better understand where other people are coming from, and the more effective we are at working through, challenges that happen in relationships. But as you all know, that life happens, right? And there are things that limit our capacities, which then limit how we can respond because the nervous system will take over. And if it does, sometimes the thing that the nervous system leads us to do is not necessarily congruent with who we are. So for example, if any of y'all are go into that fight mode that I did as a kid, there was adversity, trauma, I'd go into fight mode. While it worked to keep me safe, but as an adult, you can't just be fighting people because you're upset or there's a disagreement. So that's what I mean by there's incongruency. So healthy person, integrated experience, everything is aligned. What happens when we have an unintegrated experience? Well, let's say something happens and I don't know how to experience sadness. I don't know how to be angry and not people please for fear of not surviving, for fear of being rejected by my caretaker, or I don't know how to communicate like in a healthy way, whatever skill it is, because it's like, you can have fight or flight, but you also have like the appeasing, you have the shutting down, you have the freezing, all of the whole gambit of stress responses. So if how we're responding does not match what we're doing, that lets you know somewhere along the line, it was an experience that you had that maybe that was your only choice, and you have not really learned the skill since then. So it continues to be the thing that the brain kind of leads you to, except it's outdated now because you're no longer that kid that had to stay in that situation, right? You're an adult now. So that's what we call it, unintegrated experience, hasn't been updated. So this can lead to a sense of like disconnection. It can lead to behaviors that are not congruent. And by disconnection, I mean like either like the numbing or the reactiveness without awareness or things like that, right? Not knowing who you are, the incongruence in your actions versus what your beliefs are. You could feel like misaligned, and really what it comes out to is like you come through a difficult situation, you feel discombobulated, not really having the clarity. And we know that all of us as humans get to that place sometimes, but especially individuals with like complex trauma and that have all of this unresolved issues. Now, what I do want to mention is like the critical memories aren't always traumatic, right? So, and I mean by the sense of like the DSM definition of traumatic, because DSM would say like somebody almost died, or you almost died, or you witnessed a death. And we know there's a lot of other like situations that could lead to these beliefs that might not always include like violence or threat to your life, but there could be a threat to your sense of worth, right? Or another part of your identity. So like, for example, me being Hispanic, I only spoke Spanish until I was 5. And so going to school, they're trying to help me by putting me with kids that speak Spanish, but my little brain decided, oh, I must be the dumb one, right? Because I don't match the rest of the kids. I made that up, not knowing I made it up. I was only 5. But that critical experience shaped how the effort that I put or didn't put in school, right? How I behaved with peers, like the disconnection, the protection mechanisms that kicked in. So that would not be a common question when we're doing the PCL-5. Hey, were you ever sat in the back of the room? Like that's not an adverse experience, but it was pivotal in how I started to view myself, my role in society, and even what my capacities were. So just know those things clearly wasn't true, right? Because I was able to go to college, but those little experiences, whether traumatic or not, those critical experiences go on to limit us in other areas of our life, and also bring these like feelings of not knowing yourself, because what you really want doesn't match what you're doing, right? So think of these as kind of like policy procedure manuals for who you are, and they really influence like your thoughts, your beliefs, the way you experience emotion, how your nervous system responds, all of those things. So from the CMI lens, when they're not integrated, those experiences aren't integrated, we get the things like repetitive, like, images that come up, or what we call flashbacks, or it could be very rigid beliefs about the self or about others, very strong reactions, or, shutting down and not speaking our truth, or dysregulated nervous system. You see how it manifests in so many ways. But what we're saying is there's an experience there that has essentially programmed us, right, to be a certain way for a reason, to help us survive. But now it's causing issues because it limits us. So oftentimes approaches, like if any of you guys were trained in like cognitive approaches, or, I was all into like, hey, we got to give some, positive affirmations and imagery, things like that. And so those can all help and build our capacities. But if there is something underneath that is related to survival that is driving that behavior, it becomes like a constant battle of trying to outcompete. And you may have seen this, Asia, I don't know if you remember working with kids, but when I worked in residential, a lot of the kids they could probably teach my group better than I could, because they just knew the stuff. They knew the 28 thinking errors, they knew the distortions, they could identify it when other people were using it. But when it came time, like something popped off, they just reverted right back to that survival mechanism. And those are the limitations of those approaches. So oftentimes, we see the emotion responses as a need for the person to learn emotions management. It's a good skill, but when there's a critical memory that is driving that, an unintegrated critical memory, again, it's a constant battle, right? Same thing with the thoughts. We want to change the way a person thinks. Again, it could help, but it doesn't always resolve that critical memory. Same thing with nervous system regulation, all of these pieces. If we don't get it at the core of where it came from, there's always some limitations in terms of how effective it is, if it works at all. So what CMI is doing is we're tuning in. So we're seeing these things as signals. So the way this person thinks, right, the cycles that they get stuck in, it could be their over response to something. It could be that they just feel like, I don't know why I do this, right? Or low self-worth, or there's some like very typical like symptoms that people present with. And then there's those not so typical that wouldn't quite fit a category of like the DSM, but it's a problem that's limiting the person that you're working with. And so any of that, we teach you with CMI how to tune into the signal underneath, right? And of course, we don't know where it's coming from. Sometimes, most of the time, the client doesn't even know where it's coming from. So for us to look for a specific thing, like, a thought or an explicit experience or a certain age, we might inadvertently kind of derail them from where it's actually at, what's actually going on. And so it is probably the hardest thing to do as a clinician, because you're used to being the expert, right? But letting go of the idea that we've got to have the answer is a challenge in terms of like getting trained in CMI, and trusting that they have the answer within them and learning how to guide them to it. That's what CMI teaches you. So we tune into the signal, we get to the critical memory, right? What we call most experiential therapy would call a corrective experience. We call it a connective experience, because we're connecting back to that core self, what you could call the authentic self, the observer, when we talk about like metacognition, being able to see how you think, acknowledge or observe your feelings. That's what we're connecting to, that part of you. And what that does is, as it connects and as you re-experience, as you activate these memory networks of where all this information is stored, you have the ability to change how it's stored. And a lot of modalities use memory reconsolidation like that. This is just one of them. And we really highlight like the lessons behind it, update whatever was outdated. What results by integration is that the capacities are increased, right? So rather than trying to manage the pain of what happened to you when you were 5, we're going to walk you through so that you can reconnect to that memory trace and update it, because that pain from there belongs there, but it's not happening right now. So the pain that is coming up right now is really just unresolved, right? I call that like phantom pain, because it is disembodied. You're no longer that 5-year-old. And so what happens when you integrate it, it becomes just an experience, not an identity. That's the difference in that point. And when you could see yourself differently and not tangled up in that experience, all kinds of possibility opens up. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the word memory reconsolidation, but all it is essentially the way the brain stores information. So when you're a baby, you're learning things, right? You hear something go woof and you don't know what it is until, your parent shows you the dog, and then there's the bark and there's a dog, and you start making that connection. So you hear the bark, woof, and then next time your brain's like, that's a weird sound. Next time you see the dog, now it brings up the bark and it connects the dog to it. Now it gets a whole bigger picture, right? So every time something comes up, your brain has to make sense of it, and it starts making connections. This continues happening even after we've been exposed to pretty much the whole world, right? Like, I don't know that you can get exposed to the whole world, but everything you look in context. So we call that the library of experience that you use as a reference point by which to understand the world and make sense of other experiences and other things that you come across. So this process can happen, and unfortunately with trauma, when it's pulled up again, oftentimes it's almost like Play-Doh, right? You bring out Play-Doh, and then every time you put it in, it's not just the Play-Doh anymore. Now there's like a hair and a Cheerio stuck on it or whatever it is. It just constantly change. Unfortunately, because a lot of people are not aware of how memory works, you know, that memory they pull up and now they freak out and they're stressed about the memory being triggered. And so when they're suppressing or pushing it back or trying to look away, now it goes back, but with additional fear sprinkled on it. Right now, you're afraid of even remembering the thing that you were afraid of, and it could just compile and compile. This is how like anxiety for certain things becomes a complete, you know, incapacitation to even go to the store or whatever it is, because it can kind of work against you if you're not aware of that. What we're doing is we're having it work for us, right? By helping the individual go through and be like, look, you're safe here in the office. This is just a memory. I will walk there with you. I'm here with you. I will keep you grounded. So that's the memory reconsolidation. In terms of how we came about this, you know, looking for something to be kind of like the glue. You know, I was trained in cognitive approaches. I was trained in like eye movement therapy and somatic approaches. And it felt like almost each different modality has its own, there's a level of rigidity, right? And it's like, well, for fidelity, you have to follow it this way. And there was always the outliers. In fact, most clients are outliers, right? So this might work for this person, but this other person has this piece that is not being covered by that. So it was a lot of curiosity, really. Is there a different way to do this? Is there a way that we can encompass, right, what we've learned from all these amazing modalities, from what research tells us about attachment, about experience, about memory, about emotion, and can we find kind of the common thread that will help clinicians understand how to weave, you know, whether we weave in the cognitive side or we weave in more somatic work or we weave in like, you know, eye movements or doing this approach. And that's kind of what was driving CMI. And so it's standalone approach, but it very much can be blended and used with all the tools that you already have in your tool belt. So whenever we go through training, and us as, you know, part of the development team, we went through this ourselves too. We saw everything as a signal. That means that, and I could tell you the last couple of years, boy, have been so much growth for myself as well to see things that I missed before. But what happens as clinicians is when we have unintegrated critical memories that are driving us from beneath our conscious awareness, we don't know that it shows up, how it shows up in our sessions, right? Like we might have a certain feeling, and we hear this all the time, like transference, countertransference. That stuff is happening. It's happening no matter what, whether we're consciously aware of it or not. It's happening because it's how human minds work. We listen autobiographically. So as you're sharing about maybe your dog, I think of my dog, right? Like that's just the way the brain works. That's your reference point. You talk about food, I think of tacos because that's just the way my brain is wired. So whenever we have something in there that is our signal, we might inadvertently misread that it might be the client's. And that can impact how we respond, how we attune or not attune, or our perception of what the client needs, which might be off. It might not be really what was happening. Or it could also cause a disruption in our connection to where we inadvertently end up reinforcing like any attachment wounds, you know, especially if you're a safe person. And so there are a lot of risks with not having this, you know, done, being able to be connected to yourself. So for that, we start off with the first 2 days of training, really to like learning about the basics. What is CMI? How does it work? hopefully providing a really safe environment for you to show up as a human being, because we're all human beings first, and be able to become curious about your own stories, and then start applying some of that and see how it starts impacting the way you see the people that you serve. Because I, for myself, a couple of years ago, was really stuck with a client that was one of those that like kind of shut down, and I was like, I can't work harder than her. Well, no, it wasn't that. It was that I was not aware of some of my stuff was showing up in that moment. And, it really changed my approach in terms of being able to stay curious. So we start with the clinician. And then what are the expected results? Because once you start practicing and you go into clinical application, the biggest changes that I saw that are so difficult to articulate is really the individual's perception of self, right? They see themselves from someone that isn't able to hold everything that they've experienced, to someone who recognizes they've survived and overcome everything they've experienced. And that's a huge shift, especially when working with complex trauma. You can't just do that cognitively. You can't just do that with self-talk, right? There has to be experiences. They have to see what they're capable of. And that's what we're doing with this approach. I remember one individual, horrific trauma in the past, history of addiction. When he came in, a lot of self-hatred. And some of you that work with complex trauma probably are very familiar with that. And he came in, sat down, and he said, I think I'm beginning to like myself, which was a huge point. As I saw the process, right, as we're practicing this ourselves and using it with clients, one of my most shocking moments was a client who came in and said, I actually welcome flashbacks now. And I just was like, what? Can you repeat again? And what do you mean by that? I just need to understand. But because this individual had come to me because he was having so many flashbacks, nightmares from horrific trauma he endured ever since childhood, like 7 years old. He had gotten enough of a strong sense of self that what he was sharing was that I, meaning the strong I, right, the one that's in control, the core self, can see the experience, can experience the discomfort of that memory, and can still like be anchored in myself to be able to process it, right? And he said, when those flashbacks come up, I also know that I'm going to learn something else about me. I'm going to learn about why I do certain things. And so that's why I welcome them. And so I thought that was definitely a pivotal point for me in terms of like, this is not something that I thought was like within the realm of possibility, that, I felt like, how do we let other people know this is possible? So that kind of drives everything. Our increased capacity means that the things that once terrified us, we can now manage and handle. And I could tell you that even for me, it's been amazing to be able to handle high stress things and not completely lose my ability to like articulate or speak, or it's really transformed that. Because when we have energy suppressing things, or we're trying to hide this, or we don't want to feel uncomfortable with that, once we bring it all out and we integrate it, there's nothing else to hide. There's no charge that holds, and it frees up energy to be in the now. So those are some of the results. I hope that I went through that quick enough so that we can welcome some questions, Asia.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you so much for that overview stuff. That was really helpful just to understand more about what, CMI is and how it works, even just the modalities that kind of have been brought into it. And so, one of the questions I actually had, you kind of talked about a little bit of, I love how you said, you walk with clients so you can reconnect and update that memory, right? So they can have a different view and perception of themselves. And I was thinking about like my clients, even myself a little bit, about, the intellectualizing part, right? Of intellectualizing their emotions, their feelings, their thoughts, right? And a lot of the clients that I worked with was children, families, young adults, mostly that were in the child welfare system. So they've experienced years of trauma, years of abuse, a lot of complex trauma. And a lot of times how they would show up in my office is very much like, kind of guarded, right?
Yes.
I'm fine. Nothing, I'm good. Yes. I made it this far. I survived. And so a lot of that has been like their survival technique, right? And oftentimes when trying to get into the body and the somatic things, it's kind of like, nope, not going there. This is what it is. I'm staying here.
Yep.
Yeah. And so I would love to kind of just even hear more about how you've used CMI in those instances and kind of like what that looks like in session, especially with those clients, as you mentioned, that have complex trauma.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as you know, Asia, like you can't outwit your nervous system. You know, your nervous system kicks in before your ability to think. You can't outthink it. You can try to use logic to like ground yourself, prepare yourself, if you can stay connected to it. But once those survival mechanisms kick in, you're hijacked, right? So how do we get ahead of it? Well, when we're focusing on capacities, and it's like three specific ones, we call it fluency, agency, connectability. But the fluency has to do with your ability to be able to integrate a whole range of feelings like emotion, sensation, and cognition, thoughts. Someone who intellectualizes is really high in cognition. Like they can outthink, they can outmaneuver, but probably low in sensation and emotion. And the problem with that is this pops in before that can kick in, right? So when this is low, it's like, if I call it staying in the driver's seat. You know, think of your body, your vehicle as your vehicle, like your nervous system is the gas and the brakes, right? But if you have the gauges, I used to drive this like 72 Ford bus. I don't remember what kind of car. It was an old car with terrible paint and like bucket seats. But it was so old, like the gas gauge was broken, and all it had was like either E or F. So you go, fill up, and it stays on F until it's sputtering and runs out of gas, then it'll go to E. So it didn't help to have this, right? To just have these two gauges. Someone who has very low tolerance for emotion or for sensation can intellectualize until the emotion goes to F, right? It's full, because it goes, and many of you maybe this might be familiar. They have like two emotions, okay or pissed off. Those are the type of kids that I work with. Yeah. And so it starts off with education about how you can't outthink those things. This is how the nervous system is wired. The body doesn't speak logic. It doesn't. It has its own way of working through and its own logic, essentially, but not this type, right? And it's picking up information that you can't even be conscious of. So until you get to know it, you're not going to be able to work with it. You're not speaking its language. So yeah, we would really tune into what is it, because even intellectualization can be a form of constriction. And I'm not saying some people, are a little bit stronger in that area than others, but if we don't have some balance, then we might tune in more into see what's underneath that constriction, right? Again, a critical memory that might have started using this approach, and at some point it helped them survive. Right? So we still do CMI. It just might take me focusing them back on the experience until they start learning to do that, until they're able to stay with what's happening in their body. And that's the stuff that we teach in like clinical applications, to really tune into the body. Others get overwhelmed with the experience, with the emotion, right? So we have to kind of tune them. Again, the other gauges also need to be balanced. So hopefully that makes sense on that.
Yeah, that's helpful stuff. I actually was going to ask about how do you work with clients who avoid those memories, right? Of just, I don't even want to talk about it.
Yeah.
I'm just here because the court said I had to be here. I'm just here, right? So how to even, begin to kind of steer them that way if it's just really, sometimes just painful to even.
Yeah. So here's the thing, we don't steer, right? We're not the experts. We're not the guide. So if a client comes in, we go with where the signal's showing up. What's showing up, and we trust that is there because their human instinct is showing they have the capacity to process that, right? So I know with some modalities, they teach you to like identify big T traumas, little T traumas. I don't work that way. I'd start with, where is the signal showing up? What is a problem for you, right? So if it's my over response here, I'm not going to assume that it comes from that terrible thing that happened, because the over response there, yeah, it might have been exacerbated by the terrible thing that happened, but it might have gone down to when they were a child or a baby. It might come down to an attachment wound, right? And have nothing to do with this thing. So if like, for example, if I go through a trauma, car accident, and I get PTSD, right? The flashbacks, things like that. Some approaches might assume that that experience is what holds the key to why we can't get through it. But what we've discovered is oftentimes it was a capacity we lacked. My parents, maybe like for me as a Hispanic woman, like, you're not allowed to cry. What are you crying for? There's nothing to cry for. So not allowed to grieve. You got to get up and keep going and just survive. So there's no self-compassion. So now as I get older and I have an experience, I go straight into like, nope, I'm not going to feel sorry for myself. No self-compassion. And it can cause things to get stuck because maybe self-compassion or grief is part of what is needed to digest that experience. Right. And that's what I mean. It's way more complex than just to say this is the problem. There could be a signal that that's the problem.
That's helpful.
Yeah. Okay. Hopefully that was helpful.
Yeah. It got a lot of questions in the chat. Yeah.
Coming up. Good.
I'm going to go ahead and show them on the screen so that way we can answer them forever. So the first question is, how does this modality differ from EMDR?
So while EMDR has like the 8-phase model, right? Let's say, for example, EMDR is one modality that might begin with the negative cognition, right? And that's what they're tuning into. Not everybody is aware of the way they think. Not everybody can identify the cognition. And if we keep digging in that, maybe we find something eventually, but that might not necessarily be the thing that needs to be connected. So if you had that training and then you had somatic experiencing, let's say, because I had some of that, a somatic experiencing might assume that it's like the, internal, external, like the pendulation going in, the sensation. Well, maybe it's not that, maybe it's the cognition. Like there's all these entry points and there should be similarities between all trauma. If it's a good, effective trauma approach, there should be similarities. It should sound familiar because it means there's a universal truth that's connecting them, right? What we don't want to do is get caught in just looking for this thing. So for example, I was an art trainer for several years, and that's what I loved, that modality. Still do. I think it's a very powerful one, but it taught me to look for images, everything into an image. Well, not everything has images, right? Sometimes it could be a metaphor, but what we did have and is always clear is the felt sensation. So there's the somatic piece of it, the deep knowing that something is there. And so with CMI, we're tuning into that, teaching you how to recognize that pattern, regardless of whether it's a cognition, it's explicit memory or implicit. And the process isn't about us desensitizing or replacing. We just continue guiding them, and it happens more organically. So individuals with complex trauma, if we go in and we target a big memory, like a big T trauma, we're disrupting networks that may not have like the scaffolding to stay connected, because we all hear about neuroplasticity, but there's also this concept of neural rigidity, which means that we have to have enough of something holding on. I call it scaffolding, right? So that we don't completely collapse. And that's where you get that flooding. That's where you get the over response. Mm-hmm. And so we're teaching you to be more attuned to the individual, right? Be able to track how the process is going, not dictated by you, rather tracked, right? And supported by you. And from that point, they start discovering their strength. They start discovering how to move through this. And it starts changing how they view themselves and what they believe to be possible, right? And that's what emerges from that.
Love that. Awesome. We have another question. So does this matter use bilateral stimulation? What technique do you use to get them into their body? This person is certified in EMDR and brain spotting, so it does sound similar.
So you can always enhance your practice with things like bilateral stimulation, but the short answer is no. I could tell you this was probably one of the most difficult things for me to kind of accept. Actually, with Dr. Brian, that we had a discussion a few years ago, and he's like, you don't need the eye movements. And I thought, he's crazy, but he was right. You don't need the eye movements. And if you think about it from a logic perspective, if eye movements were necessary to process like adversity, then every time you saw a car accident or a horrific thing happen, people would be sitting there just like eyes going like that, you know, like I would see that probably more often if that's how you process, if it's necessary. Is it a tool to help integrate? Absolutely. Is it the only tool? No. What we were looking for is the most organic way, right? So what I discovered is if you're going with what the individual's ready, and they connect and their capacity comes online, they could go to the next level, that next level, next level. It's like teaching math, starting with basic numbers, addition, subtraction. They can get to a place where they can comprehend multiplication. Now, can you take them there and give them a calculator? Yes, but going through the process will build their ability and their capacity, and teach them how to build upon what they already know. And that's kind of a little bit of a different angle on it, right? That we're starting with what they're capable of I call it digesting, because it's kind of like a process, right? You go through the experience. How do you get through it? Take what you need and release what you don't.
Thanks, Steph. So we have another question that just came up. Raven said, can you give us an example that helps clarify the difference between helping a client cope with a distressing memory or sensation versus actually updating or integrating them through CMI?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's so many aspects of a memory that sometimes we don't even consider are impacted. So when we're allowing it to happen organically, right, we allow all of those pieces to come up. I had recently a client actually in the past couple months that came back. When she was younger, I used like ART and other approaches to help her with the nightmares and flashbacks. She'd been abused since she was a child, like very young child. When she came to me, she's an adult now, and I hadn't seen her in a couple of years. And she came to me and she said, you know, I live on my own now, have my own place, which is great because she grew up in foster care. And she said, but the problem is I keep putting myself in situations where I get assaulted. And so she had, you know, like a supervisor at work that gave her the creeps. She's like, somehow I end up at his house and I know I shouldn't drink and I end up drinking. She's like, what am I doing? Why would I do this to myself? So this time now I had CMI. We were able to use CMI to explore and connect. And of course, it went back to her experience of trauma. But what it went to was her inability to make a different choice, her tendency to shut off that signal in her body. So when you're 5 years old and you get a signal saying this is dangerous, you can't do nothing. Ain't nothing you can do, right? Other than like shut down or comply so that you don't die. But now she's grown. She could do something, but that had not been updated. I didn't pinpoint it. She experienced that, was able to go through and integrate that experience, which resulted in almost instantaneous change within the next week. She's setting boundaries in areas that she didn't know that she needed to set boundaries in the week before. Like all of the way she was perceiving things and tuning into herself just shifted. And there's so many other areas that these little things impact that we might not even be aware of. So yeah, that would be like an example of, okay, they're either coping would be like using regulation techniques to like decrease the intensity of the panic or the stress, right? Processing or desensitizing means it's no longer causing the flashbacks. Integrating means all of that, plus you have now fit that puzzle piece and understand how this impacts how you see the world, how you see yourself, things that you're doing, and can intentionally step out of that cycle that we get stuck in often.
That's perfect. That was a great question. So while we're waiting for more questions, I guess I'm curious. It kind of came up as we were talking about this piece, right? Of even as we're kind of getting clients to that like memory updating piece, yeah, are there specific kind of like strategies or even like mindfulness or anything like, I guess, practical strategies that you would use in CMI to kind of even just get our clients grounded before we kind of start having them tap into certain.
Absolutely. And that's where, like, if you have someone in an extreme level of distress, right? We know like eye movements, they decrease, they tune things down. They are somewhat dissociative, right? Because they tax the working memory. So you're not fully flooded with all the experiences. But if somebody already, think of it like a volume, and I'm old, so I still do this. Some of you guys might do like a button or something. But back in the day, we used to have a knob, go down or up. if somebody's speaker is full blast, like at 100, it gets really hard to tune in to that sound because it's just blasting in your ear. So yeah, some eye movements are going to help to tune it down, right? But if they're already like at a 4 or a 3, it's very low, that's going to shut it off. And now there's no signal to follow. So these are the things that like we, you know, in clinical application, we'll teach like step 0. And those are like, or 0 step is some of these things that you do to prepare them. This is where you bring all those amazing skills, all these amazing modalities that give us some tools, right, to be able to do that. But just we could do it more intentionally because we recognize when it's necessary versus it being a part of a rigid protocol where everyone gets the eye movements, everyone gets bilateral, or everyone gets this. Because not everybody might respond to that. You know, I had a lot of individuals that couldn't tolerate eye movements, but if you believe that that's the only way, then how do you like individualize it, you know, for those that can't and still follow that process? So oftentimes I'll use things like weight, you know, to ground my clients. I have a lot of like squishy stuff. Sometimes we'll do bilateral stimulation. Sometimes we'll use gum. Like we even got a discount code for the gum because we use it so often. Like there's so many ways to ground an individual to their experience. There's so many ways for them to discover what works for them is what is most important. Not us telling them that this is the thing you need to use, rather exploring with them, being curious with them so that they can know themselves and know what works for them the best.
I love how client-centered CMI is, and it gives the clients autonomy, right? It's very different than at least what I learned in grad school, right?
Yes.
It gives the client the ability to be able to, for the once in their life, right? Of I can make a decision for my life and what works best for me. Love that.
Yeah.
Okay, so we got a couple more questions before time. So how is this different from art?
So from ART, if any of you are familiar with that, really there's so many differences there. First, just like the idea and the concept behind the approach, and what is happening, like the theory behind it would be different. So like I said before, that was, hey, it's the images are the problem. And we find out, no, it sometimes, but not always, right? So like, yeah, a banana is a fruit, but not all fruit is banana. So that's one way of approaching. The other piece is there's a big piece of, you know, like art does desensitizing. So you take the emotion and you're trying to tune it down. We're actually tuning into it. So we're going up, not down. The other premise is like you want to replace it. So erase, paint, replace is one of the main tools for ART, and targeting the images, or they call it positization. So taking the scene and then putting something positive on it. Does it feel better? Yeah, plenty of times. I had clients that just were no longer having the nightmares and the flashbacks. It was very effective. But like I said, the thing that it missed that none of us thought about until I had been doing it for several years, I started noticing like the patterns, is that it didn't always change their behavior, the way they chose things, their interactions, the cycles they got caught in terms of like abusive relationships or their sense of self, like the low self-esteem. Those are some things that were so hard to like pinpoint and treat with, you know, that type of modality. Great for like flashbacks, great for nightmares, but it missed those pieces.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Thank you. And we have one more question. Okay. So this person says, would integrating a memory through our core be similar to the self-concept in IFS, where we show up for our parts using self-energy?
Yeah. You know, we actually had someone who like specializes in IFS that came and did a whole seminar on the differences, because there are similarities, but think of it this way, whereas IFS uses parts work. So like you have the core self, I think they also call it the core self, but then they have like the protective self, right? They have the, what is it? The parts that are not abandoned.
Exiles, protectors.
Exiles. Yeah, exiles. Like they identify those as identities, right? CMI really focuses on just one core. So me as an individual, I am Steph, but the observer part is what is constant, right? At one point, I was a kindergartner and identified myself with being a kindergartner. but that's not my identity. That's an experience, right? At one point, I responded with anger and identified myself as an angry person, but it was an experience and it was an adaptive response. It's not who I am. Who I am is the person, is the part of me that can change that response, that can, or manage that response, that can grow outside of this identity. And that piece, I mean, that's really what we tune into. So we don't look at any of those as like parts of us. Like, it would make sense in that context. That's how IFS conceptualizes it. We really call it an experience. That's really what differentiates us, in the sense that we want people to always see themselves as the observer, the one who can change the experience. So those identities, those or parts are like dynamic, right? The anger could be there or not. The protector can be there or not. This is the constant. So the whole reason why the whole conversation started with that IFS clinician was, he said, I think he was taught to like ask permission from the anger, kind of. And I'm like, that's like asking permission from my costume to talk to me, right? Like this, it's a protective thing that I have. And so if anger shows up, if the protector shows up, we call that constriction, right? Constriction of something. Then I continue, I make sure that by being regulated, by being present, by being attuned, I present no threat. And if there's no threat, anger just goes and sits down in the back seat, right? The protector sits down because they're like, oh, okay, we're good, and we can continue moving forward. So it's a slight difference, but it makes all the difference in terms of how we process and digest. Both can work. There's just might be some, different angle.
And Dr. Brian just put a link in the chat as well to a seminar on CMI and IFS that you're referencing. So those who want to copy that.
Yeah, and that was Justin that ran that.
Yeah. All right. So those are all of our questions, y'all. And just with a few minutes left, I mean, because I can keep asking questions. Like I tell everyone, I'm so intrigued by CMI. When I first learned about it, I'm just like, this is so awesome. I honestly cannot wait I'm taking the training in June, and I cannot wait to learn more.
You're in there too, Asia.
We're gonna have. Let me save my questions. Let me allow people to have their questions. But with just a few minutes that we have, are you all able to just kind of briefly go over next steps if anyone is interested in going deeper and signing up for the full training?
Go ahead, Brian.
Ooh, yeah. So we have some information here on this slide where you can go to sign up, the arisealliance.org. That's our website. Just click through, follow the CMI breadcrumbs. They're going to be really big and right at the front page. But as you kind of cruise through that page on CMI, you'll see some more information on the sign-up process and kind of how we organize our training, which falls into two discrete training blocks. The first training block being our foundations course. It's a 100% online synchronous training course, 2 days, where we go through the foundations of CMI and then begin to develop in our trainees the essential sort of techniques that drive the process of CMI. The clinical applications, we finish up some of those techniques, finish up the steps of the modality, and then there's a big practicum component, and then reinforcing what folks have learned all along, and developing the very many ways in which case presentations can come in, and how CMI is best suited to engage each one of these unique cases, each one of these unique presentations. So it's really preparing the individual to be ready to go on Monday with CMI. Not included in this training registration are these services we provide for mentorship. So we want to continue to provide mentorship, like consultation. That's kind of the idea there, so that folks don't feel like they're on their own after they finish the training. We very much want to keep people feeling like they're supported, because you are supported. That's our mission, is to help people go through the training, understand these concepts, deploy them effectively, but to also just develop a sense of mastery over who they are as a clinician, who they are as a CMI clinician, and how CMI can be very helpful to all sorts of different folks with all sorts of different presentations. That takes time, and so we want to support everybody in that journey. So again, the website, that link may be in chat, and it's now on the screen.
Yeah.
Brilliant, great. So that is a little bit about how to move on or advance from this presentation today.
And I believe you got a discount code, right, Asia, for...
Yep, just put it in the chat, y'all. So the link is there. And if you would like to take the full trainings, there is a discount code of $150 off for both parts. So feel free to copy and paste those codes. We'll also send them out to you as well after the webinar. So that way you all have it.
Yeah.
All
right.
If
I missed anything, I'm sorry, if I missed anything, there's this detail about CEs. We all have to do CEs, or many of us do, for our licensure. I think we offer something north of 30 CEs.
31
CE credits, 31.75. That's quite a bit. That carries me, or would carry me, over the course of a year. So that's also part of it. Is that this benefits you in satisfying your local principalities requirements for your licensure. So thank you, Asia.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you. That's an important mention. We all need those CEUs. So thank you so much. All right, y'all. Well, that is our time. So if you all have any additional questions, I believe they had a slide of their information. So feel free. You can reach out to Dr. Brian or Stefania at this information here. And we appreciate you all so much for attending. And shout out to the Arise team. Thank you all so much for offering to do this webinar. I've learned so much and it's been so helpful. So thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you, guys. Thank you for showing up.
Absolutely. Take care, everyone. And have a great weekend. We're almost at Friday.
Almost there.
Almost there.
Take care, everybody.
All right, y'all take care.